Hi guys, this is Daryl and welcome back to Book Odyssey. Today I'm going to be talking about a few of my thoughts on some of the differences between classic and modern science fiction. In Hamilton's The Universe Wreckers, it was in that novel that, for the first time, I learned Neptune had a satellite named Triton. It was from the drums of Tapajos that I first learned there was a Mato Grosso area in the Amazon basin. It was from the Black Star Passes and other stories by John W. Campbell that I first heard of relativity. The pleasure of reading about such things in the dramatic and fascinating form of science fiction gave me a push towards science that was irresistible. Science fiction has been around in some form pretty much since ancient Greece, and over this time the themes, concepts and style of science fiction have evolved because of external influences like social changes, developments and advancements in science, technology, what humanity knows and understands about itself, the world and the wider universe around us, and about existence itself. In a recent review of Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy, I mentioned that I tend to have a different brain setting when it comes to reading classic science fiction. So I thought it would be fun, because I'm a total geek, to look at some of the ways that science fiction has changed and how, as modern readers, we can and should still enjoy classic science fiction, because there's always something that we can take away from it. So for the sake of clarity, I'm defining classic sci-fi as anything written before and during the so-called golden age of sci-fi, which is roughly between 1930 and 1950, and I'm including sci-fi written up to the 70s. Everything during the 80s up to now I'm categorising as modern science fiction. Sci-fi as we know it began with the term scientific romance, an archaic, mainly British expression for the genre that was used from the 1850s to describe both fiction with elements of scientific writing. Think Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, who invented several themes now classic in science fiction and are still widely read today. The 1920s and 30s saw the rise of the pulp era, when science fiction magazines were published on cheap, pulpy paper. These publications had a unique style with colourful cover art that featured monsters, space heroes and often depicted damsels in distress, not wearing very much. The stories in these publications emphasised heroism, adventure and plot, sometimes at the expense of character and literary elements. The golden age of science fiction is often recognised as the period from the late 1930s through to the 1950s, and it was during this time when science fiction genre gained wide public attention and many classic science fiction stories were published. The golden age also saw the rise of hard science fiction and space operas. Think Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke. Following the golden age came the new wave of science fiction during the 1960s and 70s, which was a movement in sci-fi characterised by a high degree of experimentation in both form and content, a literary or artistic sensibility, and a focus on soft as opposed to hard science. Think Philip K. Dick's Ubik and A Scanner Darkly. By the early 1980s, as new personal computing technologies became an integral part of society, science fiction writers began to write about technological influences on culture and political landscapes. Think cyberpunk, such as William Gibson's Neuromancer. Emerging themes in post-80s science fiction up to today include environmental issues and ecological disasters, the implications of the expanding information universe, questions about biotechnology and nanotechnology, biohacking, gene editing, the emergence of AI and the increasing symbiosis of humanity and technology. Think The Expanse and the Culture series and authors like Alistair Reynolds and Dan Simmons. For me, one of the most distinct differences between classic and modern sci-fi lies in the writing. Of course, there are the obvious differences in language because of the periods in which the books were written. In classic sci-fi, this can sometimes lead to outdated expressions, unintentionally offensive and perhaps uncomfortable words, and words which may age a classic novel instantly. Dialogue, narrative and exposition all have an impact on how the reader digests a piece of fiction. Dialogue isn't only about characters communicating with one another, it can reveal how real people communicated with each other at the time of writing, or how the author believed people will communicate in the age the story was set, which in itself can reveal something about the time in which the book was written. Language used today is less formal, which also reflects how people's interactions are less formal too. Dialogue is casual, laden with slang and idioms, steeped in pop culture and often has a great deal more profanity in it. You'd be hard pressed to find a "See you next Tuesday" scribbled from the fountain pen of H.G. Wells, which I guess is also a sign of the times in which the writer lived. I can't imagine a publisher giving the go-ahead to casually drop an F-bomb here and there. Whereas today, swearing is a part of everyday life and therefore has made its way into our fiction. Once it may have been considered edgy, but today no one would even blink an eye. Just look at The Collapsing Empire, for example, by John Scalzi, a book with more uses of the F-word than any other book I've read. Cut to 100 years' time, who's to say all those swear words won't age this book? Who's to say in 50 years' time casually swearing won't be seen as immature as a toddler screaming in the middle of the street because their parents won't buy them whatever toy they want? In The Collapsing Empire, the constant swearing is mostly from the mouth of one particular character, and is an attempt to serve a purpose to add characterization, something which has also changed hugely since the days of classic sci-fi. I think that many classic sci-fi books often sacrifice characterization completely, or at least what I expect characterization to look like as a modern reader. When I compare character-led modern sci-fi like Altered Carbon or Red Rising, for example, with classic sci-fi such as the Foundation trilogy or 2001: A Space Odyssey, there is a clear lack of introspective character arcs. A character's development through the story, their motivations, wants, desires, fears and aversions, these can often be sacrificed on the altar of plot and hard sci-fi concepts. I often think the reasons are because, firstly, classic sci-fi were restricted by word count, which I'll go into a bit later, and secondly, because audiences have changed. On the second point, the demographic of sci-fi readers has evolved with the genre. People expect and enjoy longer forms of prose now, especially in the sci-fi genre. People want characters that they can relate to, characters that interest or intrigue them, characters that ultimately produce some kind of emotional response from the reader. But why is this? Why is it when decades ago in the 50s, 60s, 70s, readers were happy to suck in all the juicy and psychedelic concepts these authors could conjure up like prophets, without feeling the need to know that Captain Protagonist has a cat phobia and how it stems from his childhood? Do we now expect more? We expect introspection. I don't have the answer, but maybe it has something to do with sci-fi writers finding it harder to write anything new. Have all the great sci-fi stories already been told? Are we just reading rehashed ideas repackaged with new characters, and it's only in the characters that we can get something new and original? I'll take a look a bit later at this too. There are other ways in which characterization and the way characters are portrayed has changed over sci-fi's history. Diversity is certainly more prevalent in science fiction now than it has ever been before, and representation of gender roles has also moved beyond some of the cringy stereotypes that often crop up in some of the more classic sci-fi, which is obviously a sign of the times and often a sign of the social constraints of that time. I feel these issues of gender stereotyping and representation in classic sci-fi are often a sticking point for a lot of readers, and I've read reviews where it has clearly hindered their enjoyment of the book. I too have read some classic sci-fi with these issues, which led me to have some strong opinions about certain books. However, thinking back to this years later, I feel like I was being very reactionary and lacking objectivity. I feel like this is a sign of the times we're currently living in, just as when we read classic sci-fi, we're allowed to immerse ourselves in the time they lived in. It's ironic when you think about it. We, in the present, are reading a socially outdated book written in the past about a future we can't relate to because it was written in the past. I mean, it's kind of hilarious when you think about it. I think this will always be a sticking point for some people, and it's their right for it to be so. However, now I'm a little older and hopefully wiser, I try to approach these sticky issues objectively. After all, sci-fi is about taking yourself, out of your time and your preconceptions, and transporting you to another place where things are alien, strange and unrelatable. I ask myself, if I can relate to everything I read in sci-fi, what exactly is it I'm getting from this book? I often think back to Star Trek Deep Space Nine with an episode called Far Beyond the Stars, when I think of some of the social constraints sci-fi writers were up against during the golden age of sci-fi. If you haven't watched it, it's well worth it, even if you're not a Trekkie. This evolution/relaxing of social constraints, I think, has also contributed to an increase in popularity in character-led sci-fi. Protagonists don't need to be Captain America anymore. They don't have to have whiter-than-white morals, a heterocentric point of view with 2.4 children and a respectable but macho starched collar outlook. Now our protagonists don't have to be heroes anymore, at least not the type of hero we were once told heroes looked like. They get to be people with flaws and diverse characteristics and salty personalities, which for me is a great deal more interesting. But the differences between classic and modern sci-fi aren't always about society and how people think. Something as seemingly simple as how these stories were published has had a huge impact on the shape of science fiction stories, and I feel like some of the most noticeable differences between works of classic and modern science fiction are revealed by a typical book's length. If you think back to the golden age of sci-fi, for example, or even before then, many science fiction stories were written with the intention that they be read as serials printed in science fiction magazines. This was the case with Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, regarded as one of the best works of classic science fiction by many. The first trilogy of the novels were originally published as a series of 8 short stories in Astounding magazine between 1942 and 1950. Putting my writer's hat on, this restriction in word count must have impacted greatly on how Asimov approached the story, using narrative as the main vehicle, revealing concepts, interspersing it with dialogue to add character and exposition. In my review of the Foundation trilogy, I mentioned that if Asimov had been a modern sci-fi writer, I wouldn't have let him get away with putting as much exposition in the dialogue as he does. But importantly, you have to consider the constraints in word count. He didn't have room to show not tell, so to speak, or room to explore introspective individual character arcs. If we compare Foundation, which was published at 70,000 words, with Dan Simmons' first novel in the giant Hyperion cantos, Hyperion, which was published at 170,000 words, you can see that 100,000 words is over double the room Asimov had to really delve into the story, the concepts and the characters. I think this is a familiar story with a lot of classic sci-fi, although of course there will be exceptions to this, such as Dune, which was written in 1965 and had 188,000 words. But perhaps that's why it's one of the best-selling books of all time. If we move on even further, the face of publishing has changed again. We have ebooks, online publishing platforms, a boom in indie writers and publishers all expressing their art without having to think of things like printing costs, returns, upfront investments, all things that might make them think twice about how long they make their book. Of course, on the flip side of this, we have an oversaturated indie market, mostly using Amazon, which has the monopoly on this, and sometimes poorly written and edited work that might have benefited from a tight-fisted publisher screaming at them to make it shorter. As an indie writer myself, I personally enjoy the freedom I have, with no one telling me what I can and can't write about, how long it has to be, what subjects are on trend, and what themes I can and can't explore. Of course, I also don't have the pressure of thinking, if this isn't popular, how am I going to pay my mortgage? I think in today's publishing environment, we're going to see a lot of exciting and innovative sci-fi coming from indie writers with nothing to lose. This ability to take risks leads me onto a question I've been asking myself for a little while, as both a reader and a writer of sci-fi, and that's, do modern sci-fi writers actually write anything new? There are certain sci-fi concepts and tropes that continue to be utilised by science fiction writers, from crews of space bandits flying around the galaxy to AI automata uprisings. Warp drive and wormholes for faster than light travel, cryosleep, generation ships, alien enemies, dystopian governments, first contact, time travel, the list goes on. But with so many stories and ideas already having been written and established in classic sci-fi, has the modern sci-fi novel offered us anything new, anything that hasn't been done before? This is a question that has interested me for some time, so in an attempt to answer it somewhat, I thought I would take a random cross-section of Hugo Award winners and quite literally compare that trope. The Hugo Award is an annual literary award for best science fiction or fantasy works and achievements of the previous year. I randomly picked 4 classic sci-fi winners, which are Robert A. Heinlein's Double Star, which won in 1965, James Blish's A Case of Conscience, which won in 1959, Frank Herbert's Dune, which won in 1966, Joe Haldeman's Forever War, which won in 1976. I compared their themes and tropes to 4 modern sci-fi winners, which are Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game, which won in 1986, Kim Stanley Robinson's Blue Mars, which won in 1997, Anne Leckie's Ancillary Justice, which won in 2014, Kathreen Martin's A Memory Called Empire, which won in 2020. And the results are in. Robert A. Heinlein's Double Star deals with human colonising the solar system, which is also seen in Kim Stanley Robinson's Blue Mars. It also centres around Mars, also like Blue Mars, although in different ways. James Blish's A Case of Conscience deals with an ecological disaster on Earth, which is also seen in Kim Stanley Robinson's Blue Mars, and an alien race being assessed as a potential threat, which is a theme that crops up in Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game. Frank Herbert's Dune concerns an empire that spans the galaxy as well as imperialism, which are also central themes in both Anne Leckie's Ancillary Justice and Kathreen Martin's A Memory Called Empire. Both these books also contain political upheaval, which is central to Dune, and take a critical look at social elements of that culture. Joe Haldeman's The Forever War's central themes concern militarism, which can be seen in Ender's Game and Ancillary Justice, and also deals with an alien enemy, which also is central to Ender's Game. The Forever War also uses the trope of a rookie making their way up through the ranks during war, which is also a major part of Ender's Game. So, as you can see, just by taking this brief look, there are some major similarities in the themes and tropes that can't be ignored when making this comparison. Which does beg the question, is sci-fi eating itself? Possibly, but then when you look at the specifics of each of these books, there are differences in nuances, characters, technological concepts. It's in these details where the major differences lie. Widely used tropes are widely used for a reason, because they work and because people like them. I personally don't mind a good trope, as long as something different is brought along with it, and it's subverted in a way that is interesting. I think where modern sci-fi writers have to really watch out is making sure the trope they use doesn't turn out to be a cliché, which for me is pretty much unforgivable. Like I said, it's in the details of these successful themes and tropes where a book can really shine, using tools like technology, science and social structures to really transport you into that future time and otherworldly place. But sometimes these are the very things that can age sci-fi story. It was science fiction that made me want to be a scientist strongly enough to eventually make me one. That is not to say that science fiction stories can be completely trusted as a source of specific knowledge. However, the misguidings of science fiction can be unlearned. Sometimes the unlearning process is not easy, but it is a low price to pay for the gift of fascination over science. There are undoubtedly some classic sci-fi stories that just plain and simply got it wrong. The one for me that comes immediately to mind is H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. During Wells' time, they didn't have the ability to understand what exactly it was that gave the planet Mars its distinctly red hue. This led to much fascination and theories. The idea Wells explored in his story The War of the Worlds is that alien creatures lived on the planet, and what gave it its distinct red colour was a red weed that covered the entire surface of Mars. At the time, this would have fascinated readers, but now we know that Mars is not covered with red weed. We have in fact sent drones to the surface of Mars, and we've seen with our own eyes that this is in fact wrong. So can we still enjoy a science fiction story that to all intents and purposes has been superseded by the science element of the story? Does that diminish the story elements? I think for me, I go back to the earlier point I made about having an almost different brain setting for classic sci-fi, in that I don't hold the stories to the same critical boundaries. I still critique the book, as I do with everything I read, but I hold them account to a different set of rules. I think if I didn't, it would be very hard to read and appreciate these works without thinking they're completely ridiculous. In a way, I think they could almost be treated as a piece of historical fiction, in that through them you can see how far we've come. Technology, ideas, science, social structures might have changed beyond recognition, but through these stories we can see that change taking place. Other major influences on how sci-fi has evolved since the so-called Golden Age has to do with major world developments, politics, and the changing of social structures. Einstein's theory of relativity, Stephen Hawking's theory of time, 2 world wars, the development of the atom bomb, the rise of the internet, the suffragettes. What do these major historical events have in common beside their own significance? They all influence the genre of sci-fi in some form or another. Asimov said that the dropping of the atom bomb in 1945 made science fiction respectable. Once the horror at Hiroshima took place, anyone could see that science fiction writers were not merely dreamers and crackpots after all, and that is as true with classic sci-fi as it is true today. Sci-fi stories imagine worlds, realities, dimensions, theories, technology, life forms and futures that in themselves are all possibilities, but it's the events grounded in reality that will impart their influence on the stories that the sci-fi writer will tell. We just have to look at books such as 1984, The Handmaid's Tale and The Power to see social commentary. We can read countless stories about humanity moving out into the solar system as SpaceX right now explores colonizing Mars. There are endless debates about life on other planets, exoplanets in far-off star systems, the influence of AI and potential consequences of digitalism, post-humanism, space travel, time travel, the impact of human expansion and growth on the planet. All these stories have yet to be written in our lives, so for now we look to modern science fiction, which like classic may or may not get it right. What the classic and modern sci-fi writer has in common, and will always have in common, no matter what segment of history it was written, it will and always should strive to ask the ultimate question. So what is the ultimate question? That is simply, what if? Obviously this is a massive subject, and I found as I started this I really did only scratch the surface, so I'd love to know some of your guys' thoughts in the comments on everything we've discussed today and other ways you think classic sci-fi is different and has influenced modern science fiction. So that's it for my look at classic versus modern science fiction. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to hit the like button if you did. Also don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already for more videos from me on all things books. Pretty much mostly sci-fi with some fantasy in there too. So until next time guys, happy reading.